bitter and almost demonic terms. And when they described themselves and the functions they were doing, they talked about themselves in almost angelic terms. And Baruch, sort of hearing this, said there's something distortive happening here. They can't be that good, and we can't be, they can't be that bad, and we can't be that good. And those moments actually turned Baruch from a possible career in the adversarial system and began a lifelong engagement with mediation. Baruch published his first article touching on mediation while still a law student, and since then he has contributed in large and significant, in extensive and significant ways to the discourse. He has authored or co-authored 25 articles on mediation, and he has authored, co-authored, edited, and contributed to 5 books on the subject. Shortly after leaving law school, Baruch became the director of Community Dispute Services, which, if I remember correctly, was run out of the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and was one of the early community mediation centers in this country. Upon leaving, he accepted an appointment at the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra and has been teaching there since 1980. Since 1985, he has taught mediation continuously every semester or every year to law students. Between teaching and being a trainer, he is also an extensive trainer. He has trained at least 3,500 people as mediators. In 1990, he and Joe Folger began a collaboration that 4 years later produced The Promise of Mediation, which was and is a seminal and controversial work that first introduced transformative practice as a distinct practice with distinct goals. In 1999, he and Joe Folger and 2 other colleagues founded the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation, and largely through that vector, but also beyond that vector, both he and Joe have remained instrumental in the development and dissemination of transformative theory and practice ever since. So it is my pleasure to introduce one of the leading voices in our field who across a career of 45 years has made an enduring contribution as a mediator, as a trainer, as a writer, and as a teacher.
Can I say thank you?
What?
Can I say thank you for that?
You're welcome. So Rochelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. So yeah, I want to first of all congratulate you, Baruch, for this award. So Baruch is presented, although we can't do it in person as we would like, with the Lifetime Achievement Award and ADR from ACR GNY. And so we're really honored. I'm certainly honored to be a part of that recognition, given all of the years of influence that you've had, not just on transformative mediation, but on the field of mediation as a whole. And I felt it really appropriate to invite Peter to do an introduction, knowing the long history of work that you have together. And as Glenn said, knowing how much Peter has helped to amplify the message of transformative principles throughout our work and influence so many of us in learning about what you pioneered years ago when I was just starting in the 90s in mediation. So the way this is going to go is that I'm going to be basically interviewing Baruch about areas of his work and both old and new. And we'll have a conversation of sorts for maybe till about 15 past the hour. And then we want to reserve space for Q&A from those of you who are out there in cyberspace, lending your support and watching. And Glenn will be fielding those questions either through the chat, or if you want to speak them in person and video, he can facilitate that. We do have a little wiggle room to go over the 5:30 mark if it seems like there's a lot of interest and excitement. So there is some flexibility there for maybe a half hour more. So great. I think, Baruch, I wanted to start by having you talk about, because the topic of this conference is about focusing forward and about frontiers in ADR, I thought that it would be interesting and rich to hear about the formation of transformative mediation. And I know that you did that in conjunction with your colleague Joe Folger. And to just tell us a story of how it came to be, because at that time it was a big frontier. It still is really in many ways. And what obstacles and openings did you encounter in bringing this new voice of mediation into our field?
First of all, thank you, Rochelle, for doing the honor of the interview and of congratulating me on this award, which I very deeply appreciate, from ACR of Greater New York. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? So, can you hear me, Rochelle? Okay, so I'll assume everybody can hear me. So the truth of the matter is that I owe this, as so many other things, to another dear colleague who has been my colleague for longer than almost anybody in the mediation field, and that is someone that almost all of you also probably know, whose name is Josh Stolberg. Josh was the head of the national organization, American Arbitration Association, that sponsored the center that I started in San Francisco in 1976. And along the years, we had many, many connections with each other. And around 1986, Josh invited me to give a talk at a conference in Florida where they were just adopting statewide court-connected mediation on, no, I got it wrong, at an ACR conference, I was invited by Josh to do the last in a series of talks about different stages in the mediation process. And my stage was reaching agreement. It was like the ultimate thing, right? So I got to talk about success. Success is reaching agreement. And when I sat down to prepare this talk, I started thinking to myself, wait a minute, is that success? That's the definition. If you reach agreement, it's a success. And if you don't, it's a failure. And that didn't ring true to me, not from my involvement in mediation practice or my teaching or my reading and writing. So I wound up talking about something different, which I had experienced myself when I ran this mediation center in San Francisco. And that was the really successful cases were the cases where the parties walked out different than when they walked in. I tell my students now, often people walk into the mediation room looking small and mean, small into themselves and, very hostile to the other party. And the successful cases are the ones where they walk out looking large and generous. That change really always defined what was a successful case. So I tried to figure out language that would express that and gave a talk about it in Florida, and then wrote an article in 1989 where I figured out these words, empowerment and recognition. I don't know if they were the best words. Empowerment engendered a lot of misunderstanding. Recognition maybe less so. But that started the ball rolling. And after that, I really wanted to explore how common was this or wasn't it in mediation practice. I felt I needed a social scientist to help me do that, a researcher. So I went looking for one. And the Almighty helped me to find Joe Folger. and we met in the Philadelphia 30th Street train station for a date. And it was I don't know what you want to call it. It was colleagueship at first sight. And we sat down and talked about what we could do together. And thus was born, transformative mediation, basically. We met at his house many times. We met in New York many times. We wrote the book, Promise of Mediation, over the next 5 years together. And we've been going ever since, and still are. So that's the short answer to the question. As far as obstacles and openings, there were lots of obstacles.
Mhm.
Some of them caused by the sort of ambiguity of our language. Some of them caused by the fact that many people took that book as a critique of what was then conventional mediation practice as we saw it, as much of the research portrayed it. And I have to say, it was in part a critique of that practice. And, that doesn't make a lot of friends. So we encountered a lot of pushback as a result of that, and also a lot of skepticism about what people felt was an unrealistic, idealistic, almost otherworldly view of mediation that took it out of the sort of day-to-day work of producing agreements and so on. And, I think we were sort of guilty on all counts. So we sort of asked for that pushback, and we got it. On the other hand, we had wonderful openings with meeting other colleagues like Dorothy Delanoche, who became a collaborator of ours for many years, and Sally Pope, both of whom I've talked about in my writing. And that core gradually grew into this nonprofit institute that I've been involved with for many years, used to be the president of, and now I'm a board member. So I'm going to stop there. Is that helpful?
That's great. Yeah, thank you for setting that context. And so one of the things that I think is a significant differentiation between transformative mediation and facilitative, which in and of itself is very broad and is practiced in many different ways when you really look at it. But one of the things I've certainly appreciated about transformative and learning it from Peter and in reading and studying about it is that you are so clear about why you do what you do, and you're able to articulate it really concretely. And you start from the base of understanding what's actually happening between parties, and you're able to articulate that. So I wondered if you could speak to us about how a transformative lens understands conflict, how you define conflict, and how do you define what's happening between parties in conflict, and how that's different from what maybe mainstream mediation has viewed it as.
Okay. So I usually find that almost anything I say is controversial and is going to raise hackles on somebody's part. So I'm not going to worry too much about that.
Might as well go for it. Yeah.
I would say, and I'm trying to be brief in these answers so that we can, cover more questions. The biggest distinction I would say there is, and I've said in black and white in writing, so I can't back away from it, almost all intervention practice is outcome oriented. Outcome in the sense of the third party believes that the parties that are engaging him or her are looking for a certain outcome or result, whether it's the settlement of specific issues, whether it's the restoration of a relationship, or anything else like that. The outcome is the definition of what's interesting. And in most facilitative mediation, most of it is transactional. It's about the transaction, the specific event that went wrong, which now has to be set right. In transformative mediation, we realized early on that that was not what we thought was going on. What we thought was going on was something went wrong with the interaction between the parties, the human interaction that the parties were engaged in, and that the interaction became negative and ultimately toxic. between them. Whatever the interaction was about, that's the transaction. It was about something. But the thing that made the conflict bad for the parties was not that they couldn't get their share of the thing that it was about, but rather that the interaction between them turned into something negative and ugly and toxic. And they would, in many cases, have been happy to give up a lot of the stuff that it was about if only the interaction could change. But the question was, well, what can we do as interveners to help parties to restore, to regain, to detoxify the interaction? So that was our theory. That was what, we've called it different things, but essentially an interactional as opposed to a transactional theory of conflict. And that's sort of that basis has been the why behind the what and the how of transformative mediation ever since, and still is.
Yeah, and so you mentioned earlier this tension between empowerment and recognition, or those are the two terms that were selected at the outset of creating transformative, and that are very central pillars as to the what and goals. And so could you talk to us about the evolution of that a little bit, because I know that even within transformative, you've gone through some changes and learnings of your own about what is most important in those two goals of a transformative approach.
Right. So, and it's definitely true that this evolved. Our own understanding of this evolved over years. Certainly, the 10 years between the publication of The Promise of Mediation and the second edition. 10 years later, which was really a new book, and if we could have had control over the title, it would have been a different title. But publishers control titles, not authors. But in those 10 years, our understanding deepened, our understanding of practice became more concrete. Essentially, going back to the international theme, our sense was that two things get bad when interaction between two human beings gets bad. Because there are two sides to every interaction. One is what's going on for me, myself, with myself, and the other is what's going on between me and the other person. So in negative conflict, both of those things fall apart. People lose their sense of competence and confidence and become weak and scared and frustrated and that kind of thing. And secondly, they lose their sense of connection or understanding of whoever else is on the other side. And they become hostile and angry and judgmental and all those bad things. So these are the two natural sides of interaction, self and other. And in negative conflict, people experience a deterioration of their sense of self and other. And that's pretty rotten. That's a bad experience. And people do not want to live with that experience, even if they find a solution to what their problem is, which can often be found fairly easily. If they're still living with a compromised sense of their own competence and strength and the other person's decency and humanity, these are unhappy people. And they're carrying that with them outside of and past that particular transaction. So empowerment and recognition are the terms that we use to describe the way in which people can regain their sense of their own competency and the other person's decency. An empowerment shift or change is the shift from having lost my sense of competence and efficacy to regaining it. And the recognition shift is the shift from having lost my sense of connection and understanding of the other person to regaining it. So if both of those things occur, then that sets up a positive interaction, even if we're still arguing over the what, the transaction. And that's the idea of the conflict transformation cycle that we talk about in our work. And so empowerment and recognition are really the two chief kinds of changes. Transformation meaning just change. those are the two kinds of changes that occur. Hopefully. Often without anybody from the outside helping people. If it didn't happen without assistance from the outside, we would have killed each other a long time ago and nobody would be left. People make these changes by themselves. It's only when they get stuck that they need the help of a third party.
So my understanding is that that at some point you recognize that empowerment was the supreme value between empowerment and recognition as goals. Is that accurate to say? And why did you come to that conclusion or to that commitment?
So I think, yes, that is true. It might be a little bit more complicated than that, but there's no point in trying to be complicated in this short engagement. That is true. And I think and in fact, Peter Miller and I, having just reached a new stage of our colleagueship, which is becoming co-authors, and we've just finished an article that really addresses this. To put it, if I can simply, even though it's a wonderful thing to reach out to another person that you've been angry at and reconcile, recover a sense of understanding with them, reconnect with their humanity, all that is just totally wonderful. And early on, it really preoccupied us. That recognition experience is so powerful that it seems like, it's worth doing almost anything to help people experience that. But the fact of the matter is, it's not worth doing almost anything, because there's a lot of things that one can do as an intervener to promote that involve being what we say is directive, that involve the mediator directing the process so that this recognition thing happens. The problem with that is that empowerment is then disregarded and threatened. You can't get people to do something, such as understand each other, without taking away their self-determination, what we're now calling their agency. And the agency experience, the experience of people making their own, coming back to their own sense of competency and efficacy, is foundational. As long as people feel weak and uncertain and like they don't have their footing and they're shaky, it's easy to understand people who are in that kind of situation really can't on their own and from within themselves reach out to somebody else. You can't begin reaching out to somebody else unless you first come back to yourself. The coming back to yourself is the first movement that has to happen for conflict to change from negative to positive. What people have to recover is a sense of their own efficacy and competency and agency. And that's empowerment. That's what empowerment means. How do you help people do that? Well, we teach courses about that. You can't tell people to do that either. You can't get people, get yourself together. I guess you can do that, where children or parents sometimes approach us that way. It's not really a viable way of helping people to regain their sense of strength. So that's why it's supreme. It's supreme because nothing else can really happen of value until and unless people first come back to themselves. There's a second and deeper reason for that, but I'm going to wait until our article is published and I don't know if it's published yet, but when it is, you could read more about a deeper reason why empowerment is.
Okay. Yeah, well, I can see that you're a wonderful teacher because you're managing to condense some, I think, very complex ideas that I know have taken decades to develop into these nuggets that we can digest. And I appreciate, wanting to make time for us to give something of a spectrum of the work. One of the things that we often hear, I used to work for a mediation center and have been in the New York mediation world for some time. And I definitely credit Peter again with helping to move us more in this direction. But I think one of the shifts that I've noticed in facilitative mediation circles is towards more of a prizing of self-determination. And I think, you know, most people who are out there listening would agree that self-determination does need to reign supreme, that that's a really fundamental characteristic of mediation, is that parties need to have agency and choice. And I've heard people who have been exposed to transformative even assign themselves the label of transformative, or at least to say, I do transformative sometimes, or I shift into a transformative approach in certain kinds of conflict situations when I'm mediating. And then I'm facilitative at other times when that's warranted. And I understand that you have kind of a strong line about this. I don't want to set you up to make more controversy for yourself, but I think it's an important distinction to make, and I'd like to offer you a chance to just elaborate on why you see those two as not really integrated, that transformative is in and of itself a whole orientation that can't be mixed and matched.
Right. That's a common question that I get from students, from trainees, from whoever has a chance to challenge me about it. Why can't I do both? Why can't I switch back and forth? So I think that there are two reasons that it's very, very hard to integrate. If that would be sort of the ideal, right? To be able to integrate and answer and put up on your website. I do both. I do transformative in it. Usually people who say that they do both, they say something like this. They say, I start out transformative and I do it until it doesn't work, or I do it as long as it works. So then the question that I would have to them is, works to do what? Works to do what? The implication is, if we're moving towards some other useful and valuable end, like an agreement, a reconciliation, greater understanding, recognition, then I continue to honor self-determination. But if we get stuck and we're not doing that anymore, we're not moving there anymore, then I, as my students this past semester like to say, then I get a little bit directive. So I don't really believe that one can get a little bit directive. I think what happens is that if you get a little bit directive, it takes over. It's like in the law, we talk with our students about the slippery slope argument. And I think that that's the danger, and that's the likelihood of what happens. If I do, we have a principle, first principle of a transformative mediator is that I support and never supplant party decision-making. Underlining the word never. Support and never supplant. Doesn't mean I'm passive, because support involves a lot of activity. But I never supplant. I never take away decisions from parties. Once I begin, and my students this semester would say, well, can't we do a little bit of supplanting? So the answer is, well, then when do you stop? You start supplanting when the supporting is not working anymore. Working to do what? Working to achieve some other goal. But supplanting never works to support self-determination. Supplanting negates self-determination. If parties have begun to become stronger in themselves, supplanting their decision-making will weaken them. It will send them back in the wrong direction. And therefore, you can't. It doesn't work that way. So you have to stick with it. And that's our principle, support but never supplant. Two other reasons, simply. One is the skills of supporting positive interaction and moving towards agreement or reconciliation or anything else as an outcome goal are utterly different skills. So I'm lucky that I've written a lot of stuff so I can sort of answer these questions by reference. If you want to know what I mean by that, there are at least 2 published accounts of the different skill sets of facilitative and transformative mediators. The best account of that is probably in an article that I wrote in 2013. It was published in the Clinical Law Review, not exactly something that mediators read generally, but it's a terrific account of that. And a more recent account is in an article that was just published last year in the Ohio State Journal on mediation ethics and a pluralistic approach to mediation ethics. Both of those set out the skill sets standard skill sets of facilitative and transformative mediators. If you look at them, I think you come to the conclusion it's almost impossible to do both well. It's like if you're a musician, if you are a pianist, not too many pianists play the clarinet. If you're a clarinetist, not too many clarinetists play the violin because there are different skills involved. So I think that's true for facilitative and transformative mediation. And underlying that further, I think that there are different beliefs that transformative and facilitative mediators hold about who their clients are as human beings. What are their clients' capacities? Are their clients capable of managing themselves and caring about each other? I think facilitative and transformative mediators have different beliefs about those two very fundamental questions. I'm not claiming to have the last word on which of those sets of beliefs are correct, but they're different and they're very hard to combine. So that's a sort of overall answer. There's more to be said. You're welcome to, again, consult on that last question, the underlying premises. The last chapter of our second book, The Promise of Mediation, published in 2005, is all about that level, about the premises, the values underlying different approaches to mediation.
Yeah, I think
So that was a little long-winded, but
I think that is really important, and I think any mediation approach worth its salt will be able to articulate as clearly as you all have in the promise what the assumptions are that we're making about what conflict is, what the experience of conflict is, what the capacities of the parties are. So I guess along those lines.
let me add just one more thing to what you said.
Sure.
What the capacities of the parties are and what their motivations are. Both things are critical to the underlying belief system that you enter as an intervener in conflict. What do I think these people are capable of and not capable of? What do I think they want? What do I think motivates them in their lives? And those are very deeply held, those are very deeply held beliefs that we hold about each other as human beings. So I think, and if it's any approach to conflict intervention should have a clearly articulated version that says, this is what I believe about these things. I'm not sure that that's true universally. We've tried to be very clear and articulate and expressive about that stuff. I think everybody should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big sort of personal responsibility that as individual mediators we also have, is to be able to express our worldview.
It's a responsibility for people who write books about mediation, for people who teach courses.
Definitely. Yeah.
You can't get up and teach a course of mediation. Here's your toolbox.
Right.
Anybody who uses the phrase toolbox, you ought to have a lot of questions about that.
Well, so that's another question for you, because I'm taking it that your way of teaching mediation is different from the way that a lot of trainings may happen. And so maybe briefly, if you could give us a sense of like, what are the salient characteristics of how you approach introducing new mediators to the practice? Hopefully that's not too broad, but just to give a sense of where you begin at least.
Well, the essence of where we begin is, which we figured this out a long time ago, that we begin talking about why. The whole first, quarter or third or sixth of the mediation training is about the theory of conflict that we are working from. The theory of conflict as a crisis in interaction, what happens to the parties, where's the evidence for that and there's lots of evidence for that in literature, that conflict interaction is what matters most to people. We put that up front. So we start from theory. If you want to put it this way, we start from the why. What's going on? What do people care about? And why do they care about it? Why is the movement from negative to positive interaction important to people? Why do we believe that it's important to people? So we start from that, and we spend a fair amount of time on it, and we let people, throw tomatoes at us for talking about it, or for what we express as our beliefs about it, because that has to be in place to understand the next thing, which is, and so what do we then do as interveners, and why do we do it the way we do it? And you can't understand that if you haven't started out from a foundation of what's the underlying theory. So we go from theory to practice. I'm not familiar with so much training in the conflict field that does that. Theory is like something that academics do, but when we want to be practitioners, we want to know, how do you do it? We want a toolbox. A toolbox is only good if you know what you're using it for. Otherwise, you're going to wind up abusing it rather than using it. So that's one thing that's unique about our training. It's probably the most unique thing that we do. We do other things that other people do. We do simulations, we do demonstrations. So I don't think that's unique, but we always, whenever we do anything, we come back to the why question. So why did you do that? How do you connect what you just did with the underlying premises of what this is all about? If you can do it perfectly, you can, mimic what the trainers do, and lots of people can do that, but you can't explain why that makes sense in terms of your underlying principles, we're not happy. We're not happy with you. We want you to be able to understand why you do what you do and why you do it the way you do it.
Yeah, and mimicking will not get you through the unexpected, right?
That's
Once you're off.
That is absolutely correct.
Off the role plays and
Yeah.
endless variety of conflict situations.
Very true.
Yeah.
You have to know, you have to be able to always come back down to your foundation in order to know what to do in a tough spot.
Yeah. So one last question before we move on to audience, and there are already some comments. So I think we're gearing up to have some more interesting questions, but I did want to have you comment on your views of mediation's role in terms of social justice, especially in these days, as a lot of us mediators are thinking about how to be useful in the times of COVID-19 and the amplification of social inequalities that we're seeing. And I know this is a long debate in the field about where do mediators fit in terms of social justice? Is it our role to protect or advocate ever? Does mediation actually undermine power and agency in situations of social inequality? So I just wanted to hear some about that from you and turn it over to our audience.
Okay, so again, I'm fortunate to be able to refer you to things that I've already written where this issue is explored. Joe Folger and I wrote in 2012 an article called Mediation and Social Justice. You can Google that, and anybody who's interested in knowing where any of this stuff is that I mentioned can email me or let me know, and I'll let them know where the stuff is. But
I will actually put the titles of all the articles I received from you in the chat, and then I will, if you're okay with it, I can also share your email address on the chat.
100%. Okay. None of us has anything to do these days except respond to emails, so that's fine. But to offer the shortest answer I can to your question, in the terms that you framed it, which is what about the role of protection of vulnerable parties? So for a long time ago, the very first article that I wrote in 1989, the title was Efficiency and Protection or Empowerment and Recognition. Well, protection was right there in the title because clearly lots of people felt that a mediator had an obligation, and this was an article about ethics actually, that mediators had an ethical obligation to protect vulnerable parties. And my argument then was, and still is, that, and I'm not the only one, my dear colleague and mentor Josh Stolberg actually is the one who taught me this, that you can't protect and empower at the same time. You can't, it's impossible. And that a mediator's job doesn't include protection at all. Now he and others in the field, notably Larry Susskind from MIT, had their own battle about this controversy years and years ago. but I don't think either of them gave in, and it's still a controversy, as you say. My view of this is, maybe it's overly simplistic, but here it is. The way that mediators can help vulnerable parties is by helping them to stand up for themselves and be more effective advocates for themselves, which is to say, to support self-determination in the fullest, richest way possible. When people are getting the short end of the stick, first of all, that itself tends to make them feel weak and vulnerable, or to intensify their sense of weakness and vulnerability. And also they in fact can't stand up and defend themselves. Well, they can. We believe that they can. We believe people have the capacity for becoming effective advocates for themselves if they have support in doing it. And the interventions that we teach people in transformative mediation, even though they're simple, they have the effect of doing that. They have the effect of helping people to find their voice and to express it effectively, and to express it as much as they want to, but no more. Because often, if you push someone to make stronger claims for justice because you think they should, they could wind up getting hurt afterwards. And therefore, again, the most important thing we think that can be done to increase justice between parties of unequal strength is to help both of them express themselves as fully as possible. The effect of that is that weaker parties are helped to claim justice for themselves, and stronger parties are helped to listen better and be more affected by the claims of weaker parties. And that's what we think we can do as transformative mediators. We can't do more. If you move beyond that, you're becoming an advocate. You're becoming a lawyer. Be a lawyer. Be an advocate. You don't have to be a lawyer to be an advocate. Be an activist. No problem. But you can't help people. If you do that, you don't help them to regain their own power. There is an interesting set of literature on this point that's about what is called client-centered lawyering. And since we were talking about teaching, I want to mention that, which is what I try to introduce to my students as mediation students, that there is a whole approach to lawyering that we could call transformative lawyering that's based upon helping the client. And if you ever thought about being in a position of weakness and vulnerability, that's what it's like to be in a lawsuit. But lawyers can help their clients to regain their sense of their own strength and their own clarity, their own competency. And if they do so, clients become more effective in their own cases, and they become stronger, not just in that case, but moving forward. That's our approach to addressing the question of what if there's unequal power and injustice. So again, I heartily recommend reading this article. We took a long time to write it, and it was not really addressed, in our view, thoroughly in the mediation literature. A lot of the mediation literature claims that mediators themselves can, quote unquote, level the playing field, can do power balancing, can step in and protect vulnerable parties. There is no research that supports that. All the research says exactly the opposite, that doesn't work, and it often leaves parties more vulnerable than they were before. So we tried to say, well, what then? So we have to say, okay, I'm leaving the social justice thing. I don't care about that anymore. No, you don't have to do that. You have to look for a way to help people claim their own rights, claim justice for themselves. And you can do that as a mediator without undermining self-determination.
Great. Thank you so much, Baruch. And I think you're referencing mediation and social justice risks and opportunities, written
Yes.
with Joe Folger. So I put the names of various pieces of writing in the chat for all of you to copy and paste. And as Glenn said, there will be a recording available of this session at some point also, so we can reference down the road. So thank you. I know that's heavy lifting to try to get that all in. and appreciate being able to hear, directly from the source about all of these ideas that so many of us have learned about, and why they came into being. So Glenn, I think, are you there? I'm going to turn it over to you to field questions from folks who are out there. And as I said, we have time past the 5:30 mark for those who can stay. And we look forward to hearing what ideas and comments are out there.
So we have one question up in the Q&A box. Ron asks, what is the biggest change you have seen in mediation in the past 40 years?
Well, it would be a very self-serving answer to say transformative mediation. But I probably would say that's right up there. My friend Peter Miller, who moves much more often in circles of practicing mediators than I do, tells me, and Rochelle adverted to this before, that the practice of facilitative mediators has itself begun to be more conscious of the value of self-determination and the ways in which a mediator's interventions can support that value. And I'm trusting Peter. He's a pretty accurate reporter. That's a pretty big change if it's happened, because there was, despite waving hands at the value of self-determination, and I've written about this. There's another article that I wrote about court-sponsored mediation over the last 40 years, exactly the period you talk about, that presents a lot of the evidence, the research on mediation practice. And in general, it is highly directive. Mediators control things, they manage things, they direct things, and despite their waving hands at the value of self-determination, they step on the toes of that principle very, very often and very, very hard. So that if things have changed in that regard, Peter assures me that they have changed, they are changing, that's terrific. Let me take this opportunity, however, to say one thing that I don't think has changed much at all. This wasn't your question, so you can ignore this answer. What hasn't changed is the acceptance of mediation by the public at large as a unique instrument for addressing interpersonal conflict and social conflict. In New York after 9/11, a wonderful person, Maria Volpe, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, started a listserv in New York, with many of you are probably on it. And the reason she started it was her observation that after 9/11, when there were all kinds of conflicts going on, nobody came to us. It was like no one knew there was such a thing as mediation going on. And so she started this listserv to look for ways for mediators to talk to each other in a way to expand public awareness of mediation. In fact, I think that has not significantly happened. The courts have increasingly become conscious of mediation. Why? Because it is a good way to clear court calendars. That's always been true, and it remains true. And that's the least, in my opinion, valuable way for our society to use this precious and unique process. So that hasn't changed, in my opinion. I don't see the evidence that it has. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question comes from Zofnat. She says, transformation is likely to take place when both a change in mindset and actions that sustain the change. When people engage in an interaction, they are guided by their habitual ways of thinking and actions, so they keep repeating the same mistakes unless exposed to different ways of thinking and behaving. Would you agree that the role of third party is to help them expand the mind, encourage reflection on what is and what is desired, and increase awareness to more options of thinking through using theoretical conceptual models that help explore new ways of thinking? This question stems from recognizing a continuous evolvement and change of a person in their growth mindset rather than fixed, essential, or bounded fixed mindset.
Okay, first of all, it's nice to hear from Zofnat. who I have known for a long time, you know, at intervals. I'm going to respond to your question, although I'm tempted to address the last part of your question first. The Talmud tells us that if somebody does that, you can recognize that they're not a smart person. So I don't want to put myself in that box. So I want to say that I don't agree that the way to help people change their mindset is by introducing them to ideas from the outside, new theories, new frameworks that they might not have thought of. I don't agree with that. Why don't I agree with it? Because anything that comes from the outside, just look at how we educate our children and our students. Everything to be lasting and strong and sustainable has to come from the inside. And again, going back to premises about what do I believe about human beings, I believe that it's all there. Now I can connect with the last part. I don't believe that it's all there accessible, which is to say human beings have the capacity to reach deeper within themselves and to access new levels of understanding, new levels of self-control and efficacy, new levels that they didn't even dream were there before. And a lot of that, which is a kind of constructionist view of the human being, a lot of that comes through interaction and especially conflict interaction. But it's not something that has to be supplied from the outside. It's something that if people have the opportunity to reflect and think and deliberate and from a safe place respond, they can and will discover themselves. And when they do, it will be their thing. It will be part of them. It always has been part of them. It will now be, they will recognize that this is part of them, and they will want to act on this part of them and not on some more superficial and reactive level. This is what we call responding to conflict rather than reacting to conflict. But the response does not have to be prompted by substantive inputs from the outside. Now, I'm not sure that's what you meant by your question, but that's my response as I understood your question. And by the way, again, I completely agree with you about the evolving view of self. The evolution is from a less developed self to a more developed self, from less access to the inner resources to more access. And that's a hard thing to do, but it doesn't require substantive input from the outside until the person says, you know what, I don't know enough about this, I want to find out more. And then they go find it out. Okay. I'm trying to be as short-winded as I can possibly be. Not easy for me.
Great. Our next question is from Fran. She says, vulnerability is often a function of factor, social, family, immediate, community, well beyond their control. Doesn't it severely limit what is possible? Often the context in which we practice imposes time limitations, and goals are set by the courts and community mediation centers. What can you offer mediators that find themselves in that context?
Okay, I'm not sure that I see that question on the screen. I'm trying to, okay. Yeah, well, I want to refer you to, I can't refer you to our latest article because it hasn't been published yet, but I can refer you to one of the sources for it, which is the work of a very famous social psychologist named Albert Bandura, Bandura. And if you Google him, you can see his website, and he talks exactly about this, about agency, about the power of agency for human lives, the limits on it, and the way in which those limits are not nearly as powerful as we tend to think they are. And he talks about all the things that you just mentioned, all of those factors. So, one response to your question would be, yeah, those are all constraining factors, those social outside forces, whatever they are, culture, education, class, economics. Nevertheless, within the constraints, and there are always constraints, everybody functions within constraints, even, the most powerful people function within constraints. But within those constraints, there are opportunities for the exercise of self-determination and agency. And the more you exercise that muscle, the stronger it gets. The more you allow people and help people and support people to deliberate and think through and make decisions for themselves, the better they will get at doing it. The better they get at doing it, the more they will find ways to push back the boundaries of the constraining forces around them as much as is possible. Life ain't perfect. It ain't a bowl of cherries. We're all subject to those constraints. The question is, within those constraints, can you still function as a viable, full, competent human being with the power of agency that's within you? And the answer is, from someone like Bandura, from us, yes, you can. Does that mean those forces don't exist? Of course not. But that is a very good way of limiting, pushing back the constraining power of those forces on people's individual lives.
Thank you. Next question from Josh. Can you describe ways in which your religious beliefs have impacted your thinking about mediation?
Okay, that's a ringer, but I will say something about it, okay? My involvement, I am somebody who did not grow up in the Orthodox Jewish religious tradition at all. I grew up without practically any exposure to Judaism in my life, or any other religious tradition for that matter. And I came to that tradition late in life after I had already formed my bond with mediation. Whether or not I completely understood why I cared so much about mediation, I already did. And when I began studying and connecting myself to my traditional roots, if you want to call it that, it was a little scary for me because I thought, there may be no room for this kind of mediation process in a religion that, from the outset anyway, appears to be all about rules and judgments. As a matter of fact, I began to find when I just opened the books that that's not true at all. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article about this too. It's in the, oddly enough, it's in a journal called the Fordham Urban Law Journal, and it's about traditional Jewish values and ADR. And it describes what I discovered when I began looking into the traditional Jewish text. The basic principle of which is that mediation is preferable to adjudication, period. Period. That's a general principle. And the rabbinical court judge who doesn't try to effectuate compromise between the parties is considered a bad judge. I discovered that early on, and I said, whoa, thank God I don't have to give up mediation if I want to become more observant as a Jew. But I also don't have to give up being observant as a Jew in order to pursue this career that I've pursued. They go together, they don't go separately. And I will tell you one more thing for those of you who are familiar with any of the religious texts, and this is a text that almost everybody knows anyway, okay? There was a famous rabbi named Hillel. I hope I'm getting the right guy. I think I am. And what did he say? There's a section of the Talmud that's essentially addressed to judges. And these are like ethical, sort of fundamental principles for judges. One of them, and they all come from the Talmudic greats. This one comes from Hillel. He says the following. He says, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? That's it. So as I ventured into developing the transformative model, empowerment and recognition, it suddenly occurred to me, wow, Hillel was into transformative mediation. If I'm not for myself, who's going to be for me? That's empowerment. I have to first come to myself and support myself. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? If I don't think about the other person, what am I? That's the recognition value. So I have never seen any contradiction between working with the mediation process. As I say, it's a precious jewel that we have here in our society that we are unfortunately not really using to its fullest extent. But the Jewish tradition, and I'm sure others too, I'm not a comparative religion student. I haven't explored other traditions, but I'd be willing to bet that they have similar principles. So I don't think there's a difficulty there.
Baruch, I just wanted to call your attention to, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom, so you can get a sense of how many.
And there's a chat box also. So
there is, yeah. Although I think most people are putting their questions in the Q&A, just so you can see them.
Right. So I see the next one. The next one's about behavioral change. Emotion. But you do this, Glenn.
Oh, sorry. I'm just in the order in which they were asked. I'll just actually, if you wanted to start from the bottom, it's Michael asks, would you address the issue of the transformative mediator as a potted plant doing little to intervene?
Okay, yes, I will address that by advising you to buy the second edition of Promise of Mediation, which contains a very long and detailed case study, also basically taken from a videotape, which you can also buy, called Purple House Conversations. And if you read those 2 chapters and you watch that videotape, that will answer your question. There is no such thing as a decent transformative mediator who is a potted plant, which means passive, doing nothing. Transformative mediators like Peter Miller are doing lots of things all the time. They're not the things that you learned about when you studied facilitative mediation, but they're doing things. Some of my students offer this to me when I say, if you had to choose one word to describe an adjective, to describe the transformative mediator, what would it be? And some of them say passive, and they don't get a very good response from me. The ones who get it right say supportive. A transformative mediator does supportive interventions all the time, all the way through the process. There are actually numbers of videotapes now available through our institute, including a commercial dispute, including the one that I mentioned, which is an interracial dispute, including a family divorce dispute, all of which show active mediation, which is transformative mediation. That's the answer to your question.
Next question is at the top. From Gary, why can't behavioral change bring about emotional change? As court annexed mediation programs send parties to mediation, they will recognize its benefits and change their approaches to conflict. I've seen this many times. The evolution and transformation can go from the external to the internal. We will do, and we will hear.
Yeah. Okay. So this time I will start with the last sentence. Good for you, Gary, that you used that quotation, which is very relevant at this time of year near the holiday celebrating the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, where that sentence was a very critical sentence. We will do and we will hear. We will do and then we'll understand. We don't need to understand before we do. I don't want to get into a sort of religious philosophical discussion about what those words mean, and I've lost your question now. I guess it disappeared from the screen, but
I'll put it in the chat box.
I see it. No, it's okay. I see it now.
Okay.
But I think the answer is that, first of all, you got to define behavioral change and emotional change, okay? Transformative shifts like empowerment and recognition are not, quote unquote, emotional change. They may involve emotions, and transformative mediation is far more open to emotion and emotional expression than facilitative mediation, let's say, standard facilitative mediation. But when people think and deliberate and make decisions, would you call that emotional change? I would not. I would call it behavioral change. They are changing their behavior. That's action. That's behavior. To stop, to think, to evaluate on my own what this is all about, what I want to do, what I want to say, what I don't want to say. People originally said transformative mediation is too touchy-feely for me. And my answer was, it's not touchy-feely, it's thinky-feely. Thinky-feely. Because it's all based on thinking. It's all based on cognitive processing. That's what empowerment is all about. And therefore, that is behavioral change. And yes, that brings about emotional change. That's exactly the process. Empowerment shifts bring about recognition shifts, which have more to do with emotion. So as far as, I don't know what you observe and I don't know what research you've done on it, but my view is that when the process is not based upon, and again, I call this behavioral change, when the process does not involve self-determination, which is essentially the empowerment shift, the change that occurs, and it may occur, is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. It doesn't last. It doesn't outlive the mediation session often. If it does, it doesn't outlive it by very long. And most court-connected programs, as a result of that, let's go back to what we said about, the acceptance of mediation broadly. Why don't the clients of court mediation, clients who are sent to mediation in court, do they ever use mediation again in their lives voluntarily? Do they come to mediators afterwards because they saw what a wonderful process this was? Now, I don't know if you have evidence to the contrary, but the evidence that I know about says, no, they do not. That's why we still have to order people to mediation. Mediation has not developed its own customer base, its own audience, because it doesn't really offer people what they want, which is interactional change. And the results of it, even when they are temporarily satisfying, don't last. So people say, what do I need this for? And they don't come back. They don't come back. They may come back to the court because they have to, but they don't come back to a mediator, him or herself. And I think that's why, because it's not a sustainable change. Anyway, that's my response. Again, I don't know, we could probably debate these things all afternoon, but anyway, soon we have to stop. What else do we have on the table?
We have 2 questions right now. Next one, what do you see as the requisite time to work with parties to achieve those goals of transformation?
The answer to that is, my students always ask this question. In other words, when is the session done? And the answer is when the parties are done. How much time is needed? As much time as the parties want or are willing to take. But what if we haven't gone through this whole cycle by then? Well, then they've decided they don't want to do that today. That's up to them. So Transformative Mediator never ends a session. Transformative Mediator checks in with the parties to ask, do you want to go on? Do you want to stop here? What's your decision? And the accomplishment, and again, you just look at that one little intervention. What does it do? It takes the decision about how long to sit there and talk. It takes that decision away from the mediator and puts it squarely in the hands of the parties. That's called supporting and not supplanting party decision-making. Now, if you ask me, well, how long do these sessions normally take? The answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know if there's a normal answer. I know that some of the sessions that Peter Miller has mediated in the Postal Service take 6 hours. I know that other sessions that Peter Miller has mediated in the Postal Service or the family court or someplace else take 30 minutes. And sometimes the session is basically the parties sit down and they don't want to talk to each other and they realize it and they want to end the session. And that's the end of it. So it's a whole span of time depending upon the individual preferences and deliberations of the parties themselves. Okay,
Great.
next.
From Lewis, do you believe that the integrity in mediation is being lost in this age of modernization? The many changes in character of mediators through coaching, volunteering, ways in mediation for direction of the. Oh, sorry if I'm missing this, Lewis. The many changes in character of mediators through coaching, volunteering, ways in mediation for direction of for the parties to go. He adds, thank you, Professor Bush, for your charisma as an educator to other mediators. Thank you, Rochelle, for your questions and dedication over the years. Is the integrity in mediation being lost in the age of modernization?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, that sentence, I think I understand, or at least I understand what it says. I'm not sure I understand the following sentences that I guess are intended to explain what is meant by that question. I think that I would have said before this year that I think that internet mediation, which is one of the modern changes, is threatening the very character of mediation. You know, if we're talking about interpersonal interaction and empowerment recognition, you got to be face to face. That's what I would have said. This last year, I taught a class to students who mediated cases online, basically, simulated cases. And I saw that the results were terrific. They learned how to do it. The parties were affected by it. It was as effective as any class I've ever taught. So if that's the change we're talking about, I don't think that that's going to undermine the usefulness and value of mediation. It may expand its availability, and that will be good. It depends on what the mediator does in that online session. That's what risks changing the character of mediation. If mediation becomes more directive, but that's not new. That's been happening for 40 years. If mediation resists that, and it certainly can, I don't think the technological or modernization aspects are what threaten that. What threaten that are the political, institutional forces, courts that want fast agreements, institutions, companies that want fast agreements. All of that threatens the character of mediation. I'm not sure that the changes of character of mediation through coaching, volunteering, I'm not sure how that comes into it. There is, in my opinion, a transformative way to do every professional intervention. That's the next article that Peter and I are going to work on together. What does client-centered medicine look like? What does client-centered nursing look like? What does client-centered therapy look like? What does client-centered social work look like? What does client-centered engineering look like? All of these things can be done in a way that brings humanity into the process as opposed to bleeding it out of the process. So I don't think that, that's any different today than it was 40 years ago. I think it's some kind of accomplishment that after 40 years or 35 years since the publication of the Promise of Mediation, transformative mediation is still here. Transformative mediators are still here. Peter Miller is still here. And his students are still here. I think that tells us that there's plenty of room for this to flourish as we look to the future. It just requires the focus. We talked about focus on the future. It requires focus. What are you doing and why are you doing it? Anyway, you've had a lot of great questions. I'm sorry if I tend to answer them abruptly and whatever.
Well, I'll just share a follow-up comment that came from Gary. He says the customer base has expanded in jurisdictions that have automatic mediations for a while. Hard to analyze, but you know it from the mediators who have parties, attorneys now coming to them directly rather than going to court or going to them as soon as they file a case. They learned the value of mediation because at some point they were compelled to go. Mediator quality, of course, is always relevant, and good, quote, facilitative mediators inevitably are able to empower the parties to create sustainable solutions.
Okay, well, you know, I guess what I say, Gary, as a good academic is I want to see the research. That's an interesting anecdotal observation. I'd like to see the research. As I say, so far, nobody I know, none that I know of has demonstrated. And that, of course, is the argument in favor of presumptive mediation and so on. The first experiment in that is not here in New York. It was in Italy several years ago. It was the subject of a symposium that I participated in at Cardozo Law School in 2015. And the primary study that was presented at that conference, there's a symposium issue of the Cardozo Law Journal that talks about it, and I think it presents the original research as well, was that after a presumptive mediation statute passed in the European Union, which again automatically referred cases to mediation, that study suggested that it did not have the effect of engendering more utilization of mediation. Underutilization of mediation persisted even after that. And why? The fellow who wrote that article had his own ideas. I had my own ideas. And my idea is people do not want directiveness. They want the opportunity for self-determination. If there's anything that the modern era suggests to us, where people can find things on Google, buy things on Amazon, connect with people through Zoom, do things themselves, and all of these things flourish. All of these technologies that enhance individual agency and self-determination, all of them flourish. And, you know, boy, I wish I'd bought stock in Google. In Zoom. Don't all of us? We couldn't have foreseen this. But it's a tremendous thing because it allows us to do from the bottom up. So I think that there's lots to look forward to. I think a focus on the future has to be a focus on party self-determination and agency. I'm a kind of a Johnny One Note on this. I have been for many years, and I will continue to be. I think because that's what I believe. Are we?
So thank you so much, Baruch. I think, yes, we are at the end of our time, and I wanted to, I'll read one more comment that we have from Sofnat. I think it's a comment, not a question, so I'll just leave us with this thought. Knowledge and state of being happens through interaction. All that is inside comes from the outside. Sharing of knowledge does not have to be hierarchical from above. Exposure to diverse perspectives was shown to bring about more learning, innovation, and better decision making. Evolvement is through interactions, which I think is supportive of what you've been talking about, that the transformation happens through the interaction. Thank you for your time, for the excitement with which you share these ideas, and I think it's clear that it's you put so much of yourself and your life and your energy into it, and it's been contagious. You know, to me, this has really been a movement, and I think people who really get transformative get it, hang on to it, stick to it. It makes an impact, and that certainly was the case in my career and working with students now. I often hear Peter's voice inside my own head and really trying to get across the value of self-determination and why it matters so much and why agency is just so sacred, and brings us forth in ways that we ourselves may not have known we were capable of. So I hope that all of this conversation has elicited interest from those who are not familiar with the transformative approach and Baruch Bush's work, or perhaps confirmed or at least caused some sort of a rattle in you to think about these ideas a little bit more. I did put Baruch's email once again in the chat, so feel free to be in touch with him if you want to follow up. And further in the chat, further up, there were names of articles also that he had referenced through our conversation. And thank you also to Peter for being here and witnessing this conversation. I know you have so many wise insights into all of these questions yourself, and I would encourage anyone who knows Peter to also have a conversation with him. He has done this work for many years and is a wonderful teacher as well. So good to see you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Glenn, for helping us to do this tech side, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
And let me say thank you also. Thank you, Rochelle, for very great questions. And thanks also to the participants for great questions. And, you know, I hope that I haven't offended anybody in my answers, even if I've provoked some people. And I'm happy to continue the conversation. You're welcome to get in touch. And the one thing I would say is, you know, check out some of the things that I've written and see if you find answers there. Rochelle has kindly put a lot of this stuff up in the chat room, and I can share it with you as well. Thank you so much. And thanks again, ACR, for this award. It's wonderful. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you all.